5 spine-chilling winter night horror stories, animated. Story 1, The Whispering Snowfall. It was a quiet winter evening when Sarah decided to take a late-night walk through the woods behind her house. The snowfall was thick, the air biting, but the world felt strangely peaceful. As she walked, a whispering sound seemed to follow her, faint at first, but growing louder with each step. She turned to look, but there was no one there. With her heart racing, she picked up the pace, but the whispers grew more urgent. Sarah. Sarah. It was as if the wind itself was calling her name. Terrified, she sprinted back home, only to hear the whisper again, clearer this time, "Come back." That night, Sarah heard the whispers once more, this time from the attic above her bedroom. She had never heard them before. Story 2, The Frostbitten Hand. Alex was on his way home after visiting a friend in a neighboring town, but the storm was getting worse. As he neared the edge of the forest, his car slid off the icy road, stranding him in the snow. The storm raged, and there was no sign of life for miles. Desperate, Alex decided to walk to the nearest house he saw through the blizzard. After what seemed like hours, he arrived at a small, dimly lit cabin. A woman answered the door, her skin pale and her hands covered in frost. She invited him in, offering him warmth and food, but as she took his coat, Alex saw the woman's hands, frostbitten, with fingers that seemed to twitch unnaturally. When Alex turned to leave, she grabbed his arm with a frozen, unnatural grip. "You're not leaving," she whispered, her icy breath hitting his face. In a flash of fear, Alex broke free, only to find the woman had disappeared. Outside, the storm had stopped, and a strange silence filled the air. The cabin was gone. Story 3, The Frostbound Lover. Lily had always enjoyed winter nights by the fire with her boyfriend, Tom, but that particular night, things felt different. The fire crackled, but the house was freezing, even though the heater was running full blast. Tom had been acting strangely, quiet, distant, as if something was weighing on him. When Lily asked what was wrong, he simply stared at the window. She followed his gaze and saw nothing but an endless white landscape. It felt wrong. The snow seemed to close in on the house, and the temperature dropped rapidly. Suddenly, Tom turned to her, his eyes dark. "Lily, you shouldn't have opened that door." He reached out for her, his touch cold as ice. Before she could react, he vanished into the snowstorm outside, his silhouette swallowed by the endless night. The next morning, Lily found a letter left on the kitchen table. It was a love letter, written by Tom, but the date on it was over a year ago. Tom had died that night in a car accident, but somehow, his spirit had returned to warn her. The door had been a portal to a world where he still existed. Story 4, The Frozen Footprints. In a small town tucked deep in the mountains, people had been disappearing every winter. No one knew where they went, but there were rumors of a strange figure that appeared when the first snow fell, a tall, shadowy figure with glowing red eyes. Those who saw it never returned. One cold evening, Mark and his friends ventured into the woods to find out what was happening. As they hiked deeper into the forest, they saw strange footprints in the snow, large, deep, and leading toward a cave. Ignoring their fear, they followed the tracks, convinced they were getting closer to solving the mystery. Inside the cave, they found something terrifying: the frozen bodies of missing townsfolk, all standing in eerie, unnatural positions, their faces frozen in horror. The footprints led to the center of the cave, where the figure stood, watching them with its fiery red eyes. It spoke in a voice like cracking ice, "You're next." Mark and his friends tried to run, but the snowstorm outside had become a blizzard, trapping them in the cave. One by one, they were taken by the figure, their frozen bodies left behind as a warning. Story 5, The Vanishing Village. Ethan and his wife, Claire, were driving through the mountains on a winter road trip when they stumbled upon a small, seemingly abandoned village. The houses were covered in a thick layer of snow, and not a single soul was in sight. They decided to stop and explore, thinking they might find shelter for the night. As they wandered the empty streets, they noticed something odd. The village felt too quiet. It was as if time had stopped. They ventured into an old tavern and found an ancient clock still ticking. The hands were frozen at midnight, but the ticking never ceased. Suddenly, they heard footsteps. Turning around, they saw a figure approaching, a man with a cold, vacant stare. "Leave now," he warned, his voice cold as ice. "This place belongs to the night." Before they could ask more, the man vanished into the snow. Terrified, Ethan and Claire rushed to their car, but when they turned around, the village had disappeared entirely, swallowed by the storm. All that remained was a vast, empty wilderness. These stories will haunt your dreams, leaving you to wonder what secrets lie in the snow, waiting for the next unlucky traveler? Story 6, The Frozen Mirror. One cold winter evening, Emily decided to take a solo trip to her family's old cabin in the woods. The cabin had been passed down through generations, and though it had always been a place of peace, this time something felt off. As the snowstorm raged outside, Emily settled in for the night, lighting the fireplace and unpacking her things. While exploring the cabin, she came across an antique mirror, covered in layers of dust. It was an old heirloom, one she remembered seeing as a child, but something was different about it now. As she wiped away the grime, her reflection didn't match her movements. It was slow, like a delayed echo, and when she blinked, the reflection didn't blink with her. Suddenly, the reflection grinned, a wide, unnatural smile that sent chills down her spine. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered, its voice a low, rasping echo. Frozen in fear, Emily tried to turn away, but the reflection remained, twisting and distorting until a figure began to emerge from the glass. It was her, but older, with cold, lifeless eyes. The figure reached out through the mirror, its fingers like icicles, and as Emily backed away, she felt the cold of the glass seep into her skin. Before she could escape, the mirror shattered, and in the fragments, Emily saw the reflection once more. This time, it was her, staring back with that same chilling smile, trapped inside the glass forever. Story 7, The Snowman's Eyes. Jason and his sister Rachel had spent the day building the largest snowman they had ever made in their backyard. It was a perfect, classic snowman, 3 large snowballs, a carrot nose, and coal eyes. But as night fell and they admired their work from the window, something strange happened. The snowman's eyes began to glow, faintly at first, but then brighter and brighter, as if they were alive. Rachel stepped outside to investigate, calling Jason to join her. But as she approached the snowman, she felt an icy breeze wash over her, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. The eyes followed her every movement. Suddenly, the snowman's head jerked, and its body creaked like the sound of frozen branches snapping. "Come closer," a deep voice boomed, coming from the snowman's mouth. Rachel stepped back, her breath shallow with fear, but the snowman moved toward her, its coal eyes darkening. Jason, too frightened to speak, grabbed Rachel's arm and pulled her inside, but when they turned back, they saw that the snowman had moved closer to the house, standing just outside the window, staring in with its glowing eyes. That night, neither of them slept. The snowman's eyes were still watching. Story 8, The Ghostly Footsteps. On a particularly harsh winter night, Luke found himself alone in his family's old farmhouse. The house had been in his family for generations, and after his parents passed, he moved back in to keep it in the family. The wind howled outside, and the snow piled up in drifts, but inside, the house was quiet, too quiet. As he lay in bed, trying to sleep, he began to hear faint footsteps in the hallway outside his room. At first, he thought it was the wind or the house settling, but the footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking through the house. He checked the hallway, but no one was there. He told himself it was his imagination and went back to bed, but the footsteps continued, closer this time. With his heart pounding, he grabbed a flashlight and crept down the stairs, the beam of light flickering as he moved. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, he heard the footsteps again. This time, they were right behind him. He spun around, but there was nothing there. A cold, clammy breath brushed against the back of his neck. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of something old, like decay. Suddenly, he saw them, footprints in the dust, leading out the door and into the snow-covered yard. But when he looked outside, there was no one, just the endless, eerie winter night. Story 9, The Crying Woods. Every winter, strange sounds echoed through the woods near Rachel's cabin. The locals had always warned her about venturing too deep, especially on snowy nights, when the wind carried strange noises through the trees. But Rachel, curious and defiant, ignored their warnings. She decided to investigate. As she walked deeper into the woods, the snow seemed to muffle the world around her, until all she could hear was her own breath and the crunching of snow beneath her boots. Then, faintly at first, she heard it, a soft, sorrowful crying. It was the sound of someone in pain, calling out in despair. Rachel followed the sound, thinking it was a lost animal, but the crying led her further into the heart of the forest, to a place she had never been. The trees here were twisted, their branches clawing at the sky, and the crying grew louder, more frantic. Suddenly, she came upon an old, abandoned well, covered in a blanket of snow. The crying was coming from the well. Trembling, Rachel peered over the edge, only to see nothing but darkness. The crying stopped abruptly. A voice, soft but urgent, whispered from the depths of the well, "You shouldn't have come." Before she could react, the ground beneath her feet gave way. She fell, her scream lost in the howling wind as the world around her went dark. The last thing she heard was the eerie cry once more, now echoing in the distance. Story 10, The Icy Stair. Ben had always loved winter, and he often visited the small lake near his cabin to fish. It was a serene spot, quiet and peaceful, with snow covering the surface of the water like a delicate sheet. But one winter afternoon, while fishing alone, he noticed something strange. At first, it was just a flicker of movement beneath the ice, a shadow passing by, too fast to make out. Ben dismissed it as a trick of the light or an animal swimming beneath the surface. But then it happened again, only this time, the shape was unmistakable, a figure, dark and ominous, staring up at him through the ice. He stood frozen in place, his breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. The figure in the ice was watching him, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the afternoon. He took a step back, but the figure followed his every movement, its gaze never leaving him. Panic set in as Ben realized he wasn't alone. He ran back to his cabin as fast as he could, but the image of the ice-cold stare haunted him. The next morning, when he returned to the lake, the figure was gone. All that remained was the unbroken, pristine surface of the frozen water, nothing out of the ordinary. But Ben couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him beneath the ice, watching and waiting for the moment he returned. The winter nights were long, but the terror they brought would last far longer. These chilling stories are a reminder of how the snow can hide many things, not just footsteps, but souls lost to the cold, trapped in the frost. Story 11, The Howling Wind. Late one night, Mark was driving home from a late shift at work, his car navigating the snow-covered road with ease. The blizzard had started earlier, but it didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary for a winter night in the mountains. But as he got closer to home, the wind began to howl, louder and louder, until it was deafening. He rolled up his windows, but the wind seemed to follow him, getting stronger the closer he got to his house. When he finally pulled into his driveway, the wind was so fierce it rattled the car. As Mark stepped out, a strange feeling overcame him, like he was being watched. He turned toward the house, but something caught his eye in the distance, a dark figure standing at the edge of the trees, its silhouette outlined against the swirling snow. "Who's there?" Mark called out, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, it turned and slowly walked deeper into the woods, disappearing into the storm. Mark hesitated but felt an overwhelming urge to follow. He made his way through the snow, driven by an unsettling force, until he reached the edge of the trees. The wind was now so cold it cut through his clothes, but he could still see footprints in the snow, large, heavy ones. They led to a clearing, where the figure stood, staring into the distance, its face obscured by the storm. When it turned to face him, its eyes were not human. Instead, they glowed an icy blue, and a chilling laugh echoed through the wind. Mark tried to scream, but the wind swallowed his voice, and before he knew it, he was back in his car, alone. The wind was gone. But when he looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror, his face was pale, and his eyes glowed the same blue. Story 12, The Snowblind Stranger. On a quiet winter afternoon, Emma was walking home from work when a sudden snowstorm hit. The streets emptied quickly, and she found herself lost in a thick blanket of white, her vision reduced to a few feet in front of her. She quickened her pace, eager to get home before the storm worsened. But something caught her attention. A figure appeared ahead of her, moving against the howling wind. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing an old, worn coat that seemed to blend with the snow. He walked slowly, with deliberate steps, as if he knew exactly where he was going. As Emma got closer, she noticed his eyes. They were completely white, like the snow itself. "Are you lost?" she asked, her voice muffled by the storm. The man stopped and turned to face her, his face expressionless. "I am not lost, I am just waiting," he said softly, his voice carrying a strange, echoing quality. Before Emma could respond, the wind shifted, and the man's figure was swallowed by the snowstorm. She stood there for a moment, stunned, before hurrying home. But as she turned the corner to her street, she saw him again, this time standing at the end of her driveway, staring at her with his sightless eyes. She rushed inside, locking the door behind her, but the snowstorm didn't stop. The howling wind continued all night, and at dawn, Emma saw something chilling in the snow, a set of footsteps, leading from her front door to the street, but they disappeared after only a few steps. Story 13, The Frozen Heart. In the quiet village of Winter's Hollow, there was a legend about the frozen heart, a curse that would fall on anyone who dared trespass near the abandoned mansion at the edge of town. The mansion had stood empty for decades, its windows dark, its gates rusted, but that didn't stop people from telling the tale of the woman who had once lived there. According to the legend, the woman had been beautiful, with a heart as cold as the snow that fell outside. She was loved by many, but she had never loved anyone in return. One fateful winter night, a man desperate to win her affection broke into the mansion. He found her standing by the fireplace, her heart frozen in a block of ice, her eyes cold and empty. In a fit of rage, he shattered the ice, hoping to melt her heart with his love. But when he did, the mansion began to tremble, and the storm outside turned into an all-consuming blizzard. The man disappeared into the snow, never to be seen again. Now, the mansion is said to be cursed. Every winter, when the snow falls heavily, the mansion calls to those who are alone, drawing them into the woods with a promise of warmth, only to trap them in an eternal winter, their hearts as cold as the woman's. One winter evening, Hannah, a curious traveler, ignored the warnings and ventured to the mansion. As she crossed the threshold, she felt the temperature drop. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, and there, standing before her, was the woman, her eyes blank and lifeless, her heart encased in ice. "You shouldn't have come," the woman whispered, her voice like the crack of ice. "Now you are mine." As the mansion's doors slammed shut, Hannah screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the howling winds. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the earth in cold, eternal silence. Story 14, The Shadow in the Window. Rachel had always been afraid of the old farmhouse her family had inherited. It was isolated, perched on a hill with nothing but empty fields and trees for miles. But one winter, after a family argument, she decided to spend the night alone there to clear her head. The storm outside raged, the windows rattling with each gust of wind. Rachel sat by the fire, trying to focus on her book, but her mind kept drifting. It was around midnight when she first saw it, a shadow, moving past the window in the distance. At first, she thought it was a trick of the wind, the trees casting strange shapes against the glass. But the shadow didn't move like a tree branch. It was humanoid, tall and looming, with no distinct features. Rachel tried to ignore it, but the shadow returned again and again, each time closer to the window, as if it were watching her. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she told herself it was nothing, until she saw the figure standing directly outside the window, staring at her through the glass. She grabbed a flashlight and ran to the window, but when she looked outside, there was nothing. The snow had fallen so heavily that she couldn't see past the yard. The shadow was gone, but the unsettling feeling remained. That night, Rachel couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the shadow moving again, only this time, it was in the corner of her room, standing still, watching her. Story 15, The Last Train. Max had been on the late train home, his usual route through the snow-covered countryside. It was the last train of the night, and the station was deserted. The train, worn and creaking, slowly moved through the darkness, its headlights cutting through the thickening snow. He was alone in his compartment, trying to relax, when he noticed something odd. The doors between the cars kept opening and closing on their own, even though there was no one else aboard. Max dismissed it as a mechanical issue, but as the train rolled on, the lights flickered, and he heard the sound of footsteps coming from the darkened hallway. Max stood up, his heart racing, and went to investigate. He was certain no one else was on the train. As he walked toward the front of the car, he saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the hallway, its face obscured by the shadows. "Who's there?" he called out, but the figure didn't answer. Instead, it started to move toward him, slow and deliberate. Max tried to run, but the train seemed to stretch on forever, the end of the car just out of reach. The figure kept getting closer, its breath cold and heavy, until it was standing right in front of him. Max's breath caught in his throat as the figure lifted its head, revealing a face covered in frost. It's Story 16, The Icebound Caller. Lena had recently moved to a small village nestled in the mountains, seeking solitude after a painful breakup. The village was small, with only a handful of houses scattered between the towering pine trees. During her first winter there, Lena learned that the villagers rarely ventured out during snowstorms. They spoke in hushed tones about a long-standing legend. During the harshest winters, a strange caller would appear on the wind, seeking those who dared to answer. One night, the snowstorm grew particularly intense. Lena, alone in her cabin, sat by the fire with a hot drink, trying to settle into the quiet. But as the storm raged outside, she heard it, a faint ringing, like the sound of a distant bell, cutting through the howling wind. She initially thought it was a figment of her imagination, but the sound grew louder, more insistent. Lena stood up, uneasy. The ringing wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from the phone on the wall. It rang again, this time piercingly loud, echoing through the empty cabin. The caller ID was blank, but something compelled her to pick up. "Hello?" she said, her voice shaking. A deep, cold voice answered, "Come outside." Lena's heart raced. The voice sounded like it was coming from somewhere far away, like it had traveled through the storm itself. Before she could respond, the line went dead, the cabin fell silent, and the ringing stopped. She felt a chill crawl down her spine as she glanced toward the window. Outside, the storm had only intensified, but there, standing just beyond the edge of the tree line, was a figure, pale, tall, and eerily still. It was watching her with empty eyes. The wind howled louder as if urging her to open the door, but Lena knew, deep down, that if she stepped outside, she might never come back. Story 17, The Silent Blizzard. Victor had always prided himself on his ability to drive through the worst of winter storms. One snowy evening, he was heading home after a business trip, confident he could make it through the blizzard. The road was deserted, with only the occasional flicker of streetlights to guide his way. But as the storm worsened, Victor found himself in unfamiliar territory. The snow had reduced visibility to almost zero, and the sound of the wind pressing against the car was deafening. He tried to call for help, but his phone had no signal. The road was empty, no other cars, no signs of life. As he continued driving, he noticed something strange. The snowflakes, thick and fast, seemed to fall in perfect silence, not even a soft whisper of sound as they hit the ground. It was unnerving. It was as if the entire world had been swallowed by the storm. Victor's headlights caught something ahead, a figure standing at the edge of the road. At first, he thought it was a mirage, a trick of the snow, but as he got closer, he saw it clearly. A man, hunched over and covered in snow, standing still as if waiting for something. Victor slowed the car, his gut telling him something was terribly wrong. The man didn't move. His face was pale and frozen, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring straight ahead. Victor felt a wave of unease crash over him. His instincts screamed at him to turn back. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw the figure standing on the road, watching him, closer now, just a few feet from the back of his car. The silence was deafening. Victor floored the gas pedal, speeding away as fast as he could. But when he looked back again, the man had disappeared, replaced by an endless, silent blizzard that closed in, leaving him with nothing but the sound of the wind. Story 18, The Frozen Child. It was one of those long winter nights when the snow never seemed to stop falling. Jack and his wife, Maggie, had just put their baby, Sophie, to bed and were enjoying a quiet evening by the fire. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but they were safe inside, warm and cozy. Around midnight, they were startled by a soft knock at the door. Jack stood up, puzzled. Who could be out in this storm at this hour? When he opened the door, he found nothing but a thick blanket of snow, swirling in the wind. No footprints leading to the house, but something caught his eye. Just beyond the edge of the yard, there stood a small child, barely visible through the snow. The child was pale, wearing only a thin coat, and standing perfectly still, staring at him. "Hello?" Jack called out. "Are you okay?" The child didn't move, didn't respond. Jack hesitated but then stepped outside. The storm seemed to press in on him as if urging him to take the child inside. He knelt down to the child. "Are you lost?" he asked gently. The child's lips parted, but instead of speaking, the child pointed toward the house. Jack turned to look and saw Sophie's bedroom window, the curtains swaying gently. The cold feeling crept up his spine. He hadn't heard Sophie cry or make a sound. The wind picked up, and Jack shivered. But when he looked back at the child, it was gone. In a panic, he rushed inside, running to Sophie's room. Sophie was lying in her crib, perfectly still, her breath slow and shallow. But on the windowsill was a single footprint, a small, frozen print that seemed to melt the moment he touched it. A whisper of cold air brushed his face. The next morning, Sophie woke up as usual, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something cold. Story 19, The Snowman's Curse. Every winter, the residents of a remote village gathered to build a giant snowman in the town square. It was a tradition, a beloved ritual that had been carried out for generations, but no one remembered exactly when it began, or why it was so important to build the snowman to such an enormous size. The villagers just knew it had to be done. One year, a new family moved to the village. Curious, the children asked their parents about the snowman, but they were only told to never ask about it again. When they pressed further, they were warned to stay inside after the snowman was built. The night after the snowman was completed, the storm picked up, the wind howled, and the snow piled high, trapping the village in a thick white blanket. As midnight approached, the snowman came to life. It wasn't the usual snowman. They could hear its footsteps, heavy and deliberate, in the snow. The children peered out the window to see its glowing, coal black eyes staring back at them from the town square. It was moving slowly, its wooden arms creaking as it stretched. "Don't look away," the villagers whispered, but it was too late. The snowman was already searching for those who had dared to question its existence. The family that had moved to the village was never seen again, and every year after that, a new snowman would appear, larger than the last, and the cycle would continue, as if the snowman was growing stronger with each passing year, demanding to be built. Story 20, The Hollow Snow. Lily loved to walk in the woods behind her house during the winter. She enjoyed the stillness, the way the world seemed to slow down under the weight of the snow. But one particular winter, something was different. The woods felt unnaturally quiet, the air still and heavy. She wandered deeper into the forest, her feet crunching the fresh snow beneath her. After a while, she came to a clearing, a place she didn't recognize. In the center was a large, hollow snow mound, perfectly round and smooth. Curious, she walked closer, and as she reached the mound, she noticed something strange. The snow wasn't just snow, it was hollow. She could hear something, faintly at first, as though there was a hollow space inside. Her curiosity got the best of her, and she knelt down, reaching inside. Her hand brushed against something cold and hard, and as she pulled it out. Story 21, The Frostbitten Footsteps. Hannah had always been drawn to the mountains. She spent her winters hiking, taking in the breathtaking views of snowy peaks and quiet forests. But one evening, as she ventured into a particularly remote area of the mountains, the weather suddenly turned. A blizzard erupted out of nowhere, and within minutes, the landscape was reduced to a swirling sea of white. She hurried to find shelter, but the storm was relentless, pushing her deeper into the forest. Her heart raced as the snow piled higher and higher, and the wind howled with an eerie tone, as if warning her to turn back. After what felt like hours of wandering, Hannah stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. Its door creaked as she pushed it open, grateful for the refuge. The cabin was empty, but it offered warmth and a brief respite from the storm. She closed the door behind her and took a deep breath. However, as she began to explore the cabin, she noticed something odd. The floorboards creaked with the sound of footsteps that seemed to be coming from the room above her. Hannah froze. She hadn't heard anyone else enter. Cautiously, she ascended the stairs, her every step echoing in the silence. The second floor was empty, except for a single pair of footprints, leading from the farthest corner to the center of the room. Confused and growing anxious, she followed the tracks, only to find they stopped abruptly in front of the window. The snow outside was still falling, but there were no signs of anyone near the cabin. The footsteps had disappeared into thin air. Suddenly, the sound of breathing filled the room, heavy and labored. She turned sharply, but the room was still empty, no one was there. The cold presence crept closer, and the door slammed shut behind her with a force so violent that it shook the cabin. Panic surged as the temperature in the room plummeted, and her breath became visible in the freezing air. Hannah tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers started then, soft at first, but growing louder. The voice was unintelligible, like the wind itself had begun to speak. As she turned to leave, the shadow of a figure appeared in the corner of the room, tall, gaunt, and cold, with eyes that shone a piercing white. Before she could scream, the shadow lunged forward, and the world went black. Story 22, The Glowing Eyes. Marcus and his friends had always talked about exploring the deep woods during winter, and this year, they finally went through with it. They had heard rumors about strange occurrences in the forest, disappearances, unexplained lights, and eerie sounds, but Marcus didn't believe in any of it. The group trekked through the snow-covered trees, the forest as quiet as a tomb. They laughed and joked as they went, but the deeper they went, the more unsettling the silence became. The only sounds were the crunch of their boots in the snow and the occasional call of a distant bird. Suddenly, they noticed something odd, lights, faint but glowing, in the distance. They had no explanation for it. The lights weren't the soft glow of lanterns or flashlights, they seemed otherworldly, almost floating in the air. Curiosity took hold, and the group moved toward the lights. As they got closer, the lights grew brighter, flickering in rhythm, and then, without warning, they vanished. The forest grew eerily still, and Marcus could feel a chill creep over him. That's when he saw them, two glowing eyes, staring at him from the darkness between the trees. They weren't the eyes of an animal, they were human eyes, but too wide, too cold. Frozen in place, Marcus watched as the eyes blinked and then vanished into the night, only to be replaced by another pair, then another. Dozens of eyes surrounded them, all glowing faintly, watching from the shadows. His friends began to panic, turning to run, but Marcus couldn't move. The eyes closed in, moving faster now, closing the distance, and then he heard the whispers, the voices of the forest, calling to him, urging him to join them. By the time his friends realized Marcus was gone, the forest had swallowed him whole. The glowing eyes remained, as if waiting for their next victim to step too close. Story 23, The Black Ice. One of the most dangerous roads to travel in winter was the one that led to the old bridge just outside of town. The townsfolk knew the stories, how drivers, thinking the bridge was perfectly safe, had ventured onto it only to disappear into the cold, black river below. The black ice, as it was called, was infamous for its unpredictable nature. On a dark, moonless night, Thomas found himself driving on that very road, returning home after a long day at work. The snow had begun to fall heavily, and the storm made the road slippery and hard to navigate. As he approached the bridge, he hesitated. He'd heard the stories, but it seemed fine. The ice was thick, and the bridge was well traversed. He drove onto the bridge, the headlights barely cutting through the snowstorm. But just as he reached the center, the car lurched, the tires slid on the ice, and the vehicle came to a sudden stop. For a moment, everything went silent, save for the sound of the wind. He tried to reverse the car, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as the temperature inside the car began to plummet. Despite the heater running full blast, the windows fogged up, and an eerie fog rolled over the ice, shrouding everything in darkness. Then, Thomas heard it, a low, rumbling noise coming from below. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, like the sound of something moving beneath the ice. His breath quickened, and as he peered out the window, he saw them. Shadows, large and twisted, moved beneath the black ice, circling the car. The ice creaked and groaned under the weight of something massive, and then, without warning, cracks began to appear, spreading across the surface. The shadows grew closer, their eyes glowing a deep, unsettling red. Panicking, Thomas tried to start the car again, but the engine sputtered and died. The shadows rose from the ice, their forms contorting into twisted figures with long, gnarled limbs and glowing eyes. They surrounded the car, their eerie whispers growing louder and louder. With one final effort, Thomas pushed open the door and ran as fast as he could, not daring to look back. The last thing he saw was the shadows reaching out for him, their hands like claws, before the ground beneath his feet gave way, and he plunged into the freezing river below. Story 24, The Snowbound Village. Sophie had heard the stories about the village that would appear only during the harshest winters. A village hidden deep in the mountains. The stories said that it was a place untouched by time, where the people never aged and the streets were eternally covered in snow. Curiosity got the better of Sophie one cold evening, and she set out on foot to find this elusive village. The snowstorm was fierce, and the visibility was so poor that she could hardly see more than a few feet in front of her. After hours of trudging through the snow, she found it, the village. It was eerily quiet, with buildings blanketed in thick layers of snow, and no sign of life. It was as though time had stopped. Sophie wandered the streets, feeling an odd sense of familiarity, as though she had been there before, though she knew it was impossible. The houses were perfectly preserved, their windows dark, as if waiting for someone to look inside. She finally found a small inn at the village's center and decided to seek shelter there for the night. Inside, the warmth from the fire was a relief. An elderly innkeeper greeted her with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You're new here," he said softly. "Don't stay too long." Sophie was confused. "What do you mean?" The innkeeper just nodded toward the window, where snowflakes fell endlessly outside. "The village never leaves once it finds you." Story 25, The Echoes of Frost. It was an unusually cold winter, even for the northern village of U Hollow. Strange things had begun to happen when the snow started falling earlier than expected. People began hearing faint whispers in the woods at night, whispers carried by the wind, but not quite the wind itself. At first, they thought it was just the chill playing tricks on their minds, until the echoing voices grew clearer. Eliza, an outsider who had moved to U Hollow for a quiet life, didn't believe in the superstitions of the townsfolk. She laughed it off, dismissing the whispers as nothing more than an overactive imagination. But one evening, when the wind howled louder than usual, Eliza found herself alone in her cabin. The fire crackled, and the storm raged outside, but there was something different about the quiet that night. The wind began to pick up, and with it, a soft whispering sound. She froze. It wasn't the wind, it was words. First, they were unintelligible, like a faint murmur in the background, but soon, they grew clearer, almost as if they were echoing back at her from the walls of her cabin. Eliza stood up, confused, but as she walked towards the window, the whispering stopped. Just as she turned to sit back down, the voice came, louder this time, from the corner of the room. "Eliza, come closer." Her blood ran cold. The voice was unmistakably her own. Without thinking, she rushed to the door, throwing it open, but the wind rushed in, colder than she had ever felt it. As she stood on the threshold, her own voice echoed once again, this time with a terrifying command. "Don't run." The trees were twisted and silent, like specters of something long forgotten, but there was someone, standing at the edge of the woods. It was a figure, faint and shadowed, but the face was impossible to see. With dread creeping through her veins, Eliza ran, not toward the village but away from it, into the biting winds, trying to outrun her own echo. The villagers found her the next day, standing at the edge of the forest, frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror, but no words would escape her lips. Story 26, The Long Night. Alec had always hated the cold, but when his car broke down during a winter road trip, he was forced to face it head-on. The snow was coming down in thick sheets, and the road was nearly impassable. With no other option, he sought shelter in a nearby building that had appeared suddenly through the storm, a remote inn he hadn't seen listed on any maps. The inn was warm, with a cozy fire crackling in the hearth, but there was an odd, almost too perfect stillness about the place. The proprietor was a quiet man, his face tired and pale, but he greeted Alec with a curt nod and showed him to a small room. As Alec settled in, the snowstorm raged outside, blocking any hope of escape. He tried to relax, but there was something unsettling about the silence. No guests, no staff bustling around, just the fires crackling, the soft thud of the wind against the building. Hours passed, and Alec tried to fall asleep, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. At around midnight, he heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the hallway outside his room. He held his breath, but they stopped just outside the door. His heart pounded as the knob slowly turned, creaking as if someone was about to enter. But no one came. Alec slowly rose from the bed, his heart racing in his chest. He opened the door to find the hall empty, but as he stepped out, the air grew thick with an unnatural cold. The sound of footsteps continued to echo around the inn, but no one was there to make them. He rushed to the front desk to confront the innkeeper, but the man was nowhere to be found. The inn was entirely empty, and the storm outside had turned into an impenetrable whiteout. As he moved through the darkened halls, Alec began to hear whispers, low, muffled voices that seemed to come from every direction. The whispers grew louder as he stumbled through the cold, silent inn, until they converged into one unified voice. "You are not meant to leave." The doors slammed shut, and Alec realized with a jolt that the night had no end. The clock on the wall froze, the wind outside ceased, and the darkness around him grew absolute. Story 27, The Phantom's Lullaby. Erica had inherited her grandmother's old house in the mountains, a beautiful but lonely place that had stood empty for years. The house, built of stone and wood, creaked and groaned with age, but Erica loved the solitude it provided. She moved in just before the first snow of the season, eagerly anticipating the quiet of winter. But there was something strange about the house. At night, when the wind howled outside, she would hear it, a soft, haunting lullaby, sung by a woman's voice. At first, Erica thought it was her imagination, but after a few nights, the song persisted, as clear as day. One evening, as the snow began to fall heavily, Erica decided to investigate. She followed the sound of the lullaby down the narrow hallway, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpeting. The song led her to the attic door, which had always been locked. When she reached for the handle, the song stopped. Her heart raced as she slowly turned the key in the lock. The door creaked open, and there, sitting in the corner of the attic, was a dusty old rocking chair. As she stepped closer, she felt a chill run down her spine. The chair began to rock, slowly at first, then faster, as if someone invisible were sitting in it. And then, she saw it, a figure, a woman in an old, tattered nightgown, rocking back and forth. Her eyes were dark and hollow, her lips moving as if singing the lullaby just for Erica. The woman's head snapped up, her eyes locking onto Erica's with a gaze so intense that it made Erica's blood run cold. Before Erica could scream, the figure rose, her mouth stretching into a chilling smile. "I've been waiting for you." The door slammed shut, and the attic fell silent, as though nothing had ever happened. But the lullaby would never stop again, not until Erica joined the woman in the rocking chair. Story 28, The Winter Demon. The people of Red Hollow always told stories of the Winter Demon, a creature that roamed the mountain passes during the harshest winters. They said it was an ancient being, cursed to live in the ice and snow, feeding on the warmth of human life. No one in the village had ever seen it. But every year, as winter drew near, the air grew thick with fear, and the tales of the demon's hunger resurfaced. Jake, a young hunter who had just moved to Red Hollow, didn't believe in such things. But that winter, something changed. It started when he ventured out on a hunting trip up the mountain. The storm had been relentless, the wind howling through the trees, and snow fell in thick, swirling sheets. The deeper into the mountain he went, the more the silence consumed him. It was as if the forest itself had fallen still. Then, he saw it, a figure, cloaked in tattered furs, with skin as white as snow and eyes that glowed like embers. It moved with unnatural speed, its limbs long and twisted, leaving no tracks behind. Jake tried to flee, but the creature was too fast. It caught him easily, its cold hand wrapping around his throat, draining the warmth from his body. Before the darkness overtook him, Jake heard its voice, a low, rasping whisper that sent a chill to his bones. "I feast on the heat of life. You will warm me for the long winter." The next morning, the villagers found Jake's body, frozen and lifeless, his eyes wide in terror. The winter demon had claimed another soul. Story 29, The Frozen Mirror. Eva had always loved the beauty of winter, the way the snow transformed everything into a perfect white wonderland. She had recently moved into an old house, nestled at the edge of a snowy field, hoping for peace and quiet. But something was off about the place.